future.
Yes. So you tell me when I start and we can move forward.
Normally it's working now. So we have the pleasure to have César Castillo-Garcia, who is from the New School of Social Research and Paris School of Economics, and he will present today a presentation entitled Waves of Neoliberalism, Revisiting the Authoritarian Patterns of Capitalism in South America from 1940 to the 1990s. César, the floor is yours for like 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions. You can start.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me put the timer here. So thank you for the presentation and for the invitation. Thank you, and thank you. I want to thank also Grégoire. He spread the voice about the seminar, so and invite me as well to present this work, which is basically focused. It's not a quantitative work; it's more a qualitative one, and it's basically a genealogy or a reconstruction of the narrative regarding neoliberalism in South America, and specifically in the Peruvian about the Peruvian case. And I'm saying or making this comparison between the quantitative and the qualitative way of doing this research, because usually from the perspective of political economy, the research about the neoliberalism is mostly focused on a specific concept, which is called is traced basically as a research of regimes of accumulation or accumulation regimes, which means that to historize institutions in the so-called neoliberal period in between the 1970s, late 70s, and 1990s, or in some specific political economies, as Latin American ones or the Asian and African ones, till 2000s. So this research, on the other hand, this research is mostly focused with the reconstruction of the discourse of neoliberalism and how it was incepted in specific country cases. And again, in the specific case of Peru, usually the narrative tries to talk about the case of Pinochet, the 1970s coup d'etat in Chile, and the association in between neoliberalism and dictatorships. But what I found out, and many researchers talk about this since the 2019 or 2006, is that the neoliberals in Latin America were doing their or were defining their influence since the 60s or almost before. In the case of Peru, since the 1950s, 1940s. And I remember that during this research, I found out this, and this is a piece, a tiny example. I mean, that this is the work of an American specialist on international international economic affairs, Norman Bailey, who was a former also advisor of the Reagan administration in terms of international security. And he wrote a paper about the neoliberal organizations in Latin America, identifying many policymakers, businessmen, lawyers, economists, who were taking part or who were calling themselves neoliberals. So it's not that even the word emerged in the Latin American discussion or in the social science discussion as a pejorative word, but mostly as a way to identify this group of people, and as a way that these people were self-identifying themselves. And moving to the case of Peru specifically, since the 1940s, the Peruvian political economy had experienced a lot of macroeconomic reforms concerning the lifting of foreign exchange controls or the application of austerity policies to equilibrate the fiscal budget during the late 50s, beginning of the 60s. and during the 60s and 70s, some groups, as this one that you can see here in this clipping of Correo, Correo Expreso. Expreso is also a newspaper, an old newspaper in Peru, in which they mentioned this group, Acción para el Desarrollo, Action for Development, which was basically one of these neoliberal groups identified by Norman Bailey in the former work that I show regarding these neoliberals in Latin America. So APD. So let me, I think that I have problems with my slides. Let me, oh well, it's okay, let me stop with this and maybe I can show this in the, yes. So, and then we have this influence during the 40s, 60s, 70s, moving during the 70s, in which most of these actors gather in a new in newspapers as Opinión Libre as well, and some of them also taking part of specific political or economic political moments in the Peruvian history, as the self-coup d'etat of Fujimori in the 1990s. For instance, in this this is a clipping of the message that the Fujimori's Minister of Finance, Juan Carlos Hurtado Miller, presented or discussed in front of the public opinion in Peru to announce the Fuji shock, or the application of austerity policies in the 1990s. But again, Juan Carlos Hurtado Miller was really close to the former group that I mentioned, Acción para el Desarrollo, and the other people gathered in neoliberal political movements in Peru as the Movimiento Libertad of Mario Vargas Llosa. If some of you had some, if some of you already know about the Latin American studies or heard about one of the Peruvian, or the only Peruvian Nobel Prize that exists in literature, Mario Vargas Llosa, he was contending with Alberto Fujimori in the 1990s election in Peru. So in his group of advisors, he was a lot of people related to this newspaper, Opinión Libre, and to this other newspaper that I forgot to mention, which is going to be important in my history, La Prensa. La Prensa was a newspaper created during the 30s, or sorry, during the 1920s, but which in the 30s became a property of this person of here. This guy of here is the former Minister of Finance of Peru in the late 1950s, Pedro Beltrán, who was one of the main neoliberals, or one of the main intellectuals related to Ludwig von Mises or Henry Hazlitt in the late 1940s. So again, I mean, I already mentioned this issue of the narratives, but I only want to stress this idea that usually the research goes to try to tackle this traditional narrative about neoliberalism as a child of the Cold War, as a concept, trying to identify this Pinochet's coup d'etat, but also a concept which is really associated with the Chilean Chicago-Boys. So it's like really how can I say this, Chilean defined in that way. But the new research is moving towards specific two events and the network of intellectuals related with these two events, which are the WalterLippmann Colloquium celebrated in Paris in 1938, and the first meeting of the Mont Pèlerin Society, celebrated in 1947, gathered most of these neoliberal intellectuals that I mentioned. And so the idea is to trace the evolution of the neoliberal discourse since the beginning of these meetings, and figure out how did it get to the Peruvian area, the Peruvian public sphere, and the additional analytical step or methodological step, is to figure out that it's not only that Peruvian intellectuals are importing these ideas, but also they are creating their own neoliberal discourse. They are adding additional issues coming basically from these more authoritarian patterns, connecting developmental policies with the idea that the state is the only one defining the way that the people should live in a more modernized and a modernizing country. The idea that the executive branch should be strong in contrast to the parliament. So even though some of these neoliberals, as Pedro Beltrán, got to office during democratic regimes, because Pedro Beltrán was a prime minister during the democratic regime of Manuel Prado Garteche, the late 1950s, they still think about these more authoritarian patterns, the idea of a strong and impartial state, which is also characterized by a austerity or a equilibrium budget state, but also their strong criticism to the Marxist movement, the so-called Marxist movement of leftist populists represented by the APRA, which was an important movement in South America since the 1930s, originated in Peru, led by Aya de la Torre, and they were proposing the application of structuralist policies, says that the idea that for modernizing the country, the Peruvian government should have economic congress, economic council, and the state should increase their interventions. So for the Peruvian neoliberals, the APRA represented these forms of collectivism that the traditional neoliberals were criticizing a lot. But at the same time, both the Peruvian neoliberals and the European and American neoliberals were looking or taking care of a social minimum for the people. So they were trying to impose specific ways of modernizing the educative system. So the education system could open the possibility for most of the working class people or the poor people to get into the social mobility system. But again, every time by or without, or they think about the design of these social policies without breaking the equilibrium between the government and the system of market competition. So they create a specific term, especially this guy, Pedro Beltrán, and other businessmen gathered in these neoliberal groups, the idea that the private initiative, the private sector should be the main actor in the development of the country, the evolution of the country. So again, it's like entanglement of different concepts or different topics and that characterize this neoliberal discourse. And also this explains a little bit evolution, the distributive evolution, or the evolution of the distribution of, or the relationship between here, the amount of profits and the amount of wages, the ratio of exploitation rate in the country. I'm not going to talk about this. I know that this is a more quantitative stuff, but not so complicated, neither or complex, but still my aim was to trace this specific qualitative or discursive evolution and try to make sense of these structural distributive outcomes. So the way that I like to think on this long-run evolution of the neoliberal discourse is by identifying waves of neoliberalism. I know that I got many criticism about this way of framing the topic, but I think that it helps us because what we have in terms of evolution of the discourse or the neoliberal ideology is different actors actualizing this agenda, this neoliberal agenda, or making it to be concrete, but at the same time, these actors are influencing the new offsprings, saying that we have also neoliberal legacies in the country. And currently it's important because if we look at the current situation in Peru and related with these right-wing populist movements, one curious thing that happens is that most of these pro-market or pro-free market economy actors are not really concerned or with the constituency or with the political debate, as long as it doesn't make any damage to the economic structure. Says that they are more taking care about this economic policy institution, or these institutions of the economic policy, or the social policies to maintain the economic equilibrium. Anyway, the issues that I identify, one of the first waves coming from the 1945 to 1948, which is the time in which the term neoliberalism emerged in the Peruvian discussions by means of the participation of a French intellectual, Louis Baudin. Louis Baudin became famous in France because he wrote a book called The Socialist Empire of the Incas, in which he has a specific neoliberal or pro or free market narrative about the way that the Incas empire resembled a collectivist society, a society of planification. And he was invited by the members of the just created in 1947 Instituto Ribagüero of the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, the Catholic University of Peru. And he got really close to one of the members of this Instituto Ribagüero, who was Rómulo Ferrero. Rómulo Ferrero, during the late 1945 and the late 1948, became Minister of Finances of Peru. And this guy was designing this a proposal of a budget of stabilization back in the days, and also the proposal for the flexibilization of the foreign exchange rate. Back in the times during that period, 1945 and 1946, 1947, Peru was having a scarcity of American currency, and in tandem with going in tandem with unbalance or disbalance of the balance of payments. So a disequilibrium of balance of payments. Sorry. So that was a situation that the agri-exporters were trying to, the exporters in agriculture industry were trying to solve by means of the direct intervention in the technocratic structure. And one of these actors representing this kind of influence of the main business groups related to the agriculture industry was Rómulo Ferrero. But Rómulo Ferrero also was documented as the first member of the Mont Pèlerin Society in Peru. Again, this Mont Pèlerin Society is this group of neoliberals gathered since 1947 as well. He became a member of this group in the 1958, even though he was popularizing these liberal free market ideas since the 1940s already. Then we have in the 1948, 1956, the political active participation, but also the appointment of Pedro Beltrán as a president of the Central Bank of Peru. And he, by means of his newspaper, La Prensa, was criticizing the Peruvian government during that time for applying interventionist or pro-state policies and tried to support the coup d'etat de Odría. Even though he was not really involved, he was a kind of intellectual support of Odría's intervention. Manuel Odría was, after the Peruvian government faced this economic crisis during the late 40s, Manuel Odría was the colonel who attempted coup d'etat to get rid of or to solve the economic crisis and the political crisis in the country. But then we have a new set of interventions of neoliberal actors, again, mainly of Pedro Beltrán during the 1956 towards the 1968. I mean that, and here is not only Pedro Beltrán per se, that I already told you that he was the prime minister, the Minister of Finance. He was also involved in the final design of the alliance of the Charter of Punta del Este, which is the main document of a program of development financed by the United States for Latin America, which is the Alliance for Progress within the Kennedy administration. But also he was proposing as a peculiar way of doing economic development in Peru, which was to propose a certainly free market, this agrarian reform, saying that instead of confiscating the land of the great hacendados in Peru, of the great landlords in the country, he proposes like a market of transfer of property rights commanded by a specific price and designed by the state, and also a system of housing to solve the problem of the increasing population or the population boom in Peru back in the days. And joining this history during this time, there are 2 or 3 other groups. 2 of them, one of them I already mentioned, this group of technocrats gathering the Acción para el Desarrollo, but also Action for Development, but also the Center for the Documentation or for the Socioeconomic Documentation, which was basically a group of journalists of Pedro Beltrán's newspaper, La Prensa, who were gathered in the promotion and the popularization of free market ideas. I'm going to show you some pictures of some of the books that they printed. And finally, some of these neoliberals were gathered in the after the 1968, 1979, the transition towards more conservative political structure after the regime of Juan Velasco Alvarado. Juan Velasco Alvarado was a progressive military who attempted a coup d'etat in the 1968 to the 1974, and he was the main one in applying industrialization policies. So most of these neoliberals were against the application of these developmental policies, more progressive, more pro-state. So they decided to propose a new constitution through a constitutional assembly of 1979 and a new set of stabilization policies. And most of them gathered in this Instituto de Libertad y Democracia financed by Hernando de Soto. So this whole, again, this whole archival research and this periodization allows to ask the researchers of the Peruvian case to trace these networks coming from the 1940, in which again we have evidence that the main actors in these neoliberal networks in the 1940s were Rómulo Ferrero, Pedro Beltrán, but also they were connected with these intellectuals of these many institutions or these different spaces concerning the economic and social policies in Peru, but also we have other politicians or political actors as Mario Vargas Llosa, as I already mentioned, or even well-known in Peru, an important engineer of the stabilization policies of the 1979, which is Roberto Busada, who was also behind this group of neoliberals. And again, with this information, we also traced the institutions that were behind this kind of developments. I mentioned already the Acción para el Desarrollo, but also, and I forgot to mention that Pedro Beltrán and some of his journalists associated or gathered in this Centro de Documentación Económico y Social were members of the Opus Dei. Opus Dei was, well, some of you already know, I suppose, this Catholic conservative group, which many connections in both Spain, Latin America, and in Europe, kind of. So Opus Dei in the 1960s was an important actor to criticize the discourse of the progressive branch of the Catholic Church during that decade of the 60s, the theology of liberation. So many of these neoliberals, as the members of La Prensa, of Acción para el Desarrollo, were gathered or were affiliated to the Opus Dei as well, the same Pedro Beltrán. So getting to these more concrete examples or more archival evidence. So only to show you part of this, or this first, the evidence of the first two waves in this discussion. So I have this first clipping with the mention of the word neoliberalism in Peru since 1947. Here, the clipping for the newspaper La Prensa saying like, Louis Baudin talk us about neoliberalism, a new ideological strain in development. I already mentioned this and the way that he became famous in the French discussion, and these the two front matters of the main works that Baudin wrote about the Incas Empire. It's really funny because the 1928 work of Baudin was titled "The Socialist Empire of the Incas." And the second one of the 1947 is the year of the Mont Pèlerin Society meeting as well. It's like the Incas of Peru, essays about the socialism, which is really, really fascinating. And I think that it's more important because Baudin was not only well known in France or in Peru, but also he was an active member of a specific commission of the design of fiscal systems in the League of Nations in the 1938 and 1939, and that was also the way that he became really popular in these networks for these networks of intellectuals in the countries of Latin America. This is the figure of Pedro Beltrán, as I mentioned. He was, as a personality, he's also really complex. As many personas for talking in this, for saying that in that way. He was the first alumni, the first Peruvian alumni from the LSE. So in that way, he got well connected or well known by important people, both in the British business environment, but also in the American environment. But he took part of a specific business group, the Guild of Agriculture Exporters, Sociedad Nacional Agraria. That's the reason why he was also really involved in the discussions of fiscal policies and monetary policies in Peru. Then he became vice chairman of the central bank, and then director or president of the central bank in the 1940s, as I mentioned. And he was the head of the Peruvian delegation before the Bretton Woods conference as well in 1944. So all these, and again I mentioned this issue of the time in which he became the representative of the Latin American countries before the United States during the Inter-American Economic Conference in Punta del Este. And I mean, all these appointments make him to get well known by the American, by part of the American conservative politicians, by many technocratic actors in Latin America, and also to become an interesting character for the people in the Mont Pèlerin Society. That's the way that he was also invited to take part of this network of neoliberal intellectuals. And Rómulo Ferrero, who was more like a kind of professional a national or domestic professional from Peru that, as I already mentioned, he was involved in these discussions about the foreign exchange rate and also the Agrarian Commission looking for this free market solution to the concentration of the land. And also he became kind of a specialist in development policies. That's the important part, I think, or the one interesting part. After his appointment as a member of the Mont Pèlerin Society in 1958, he became well known for talking about development policies from a more free market perspective in Latin America. Again, back in the days in the 1950s, if some of you know about the Latin American situation, one specific blueprint for development was imposed, which was this industrialization but substitution of imports, which was also one element in the whole development recipe of the Economic Commission for Latin America, the ICLAC or the CEPAL, and the ICLAC had their own strain of economic development thought, which was the structuralism, inspired in the words of Raúl Prebisch. But these guys, as Rómulo Ferrero, had an opposite discourse and an opposite economic thought regarding development, saying that industrialization by substitution of imports is not the right way to do. The thing that the countries as Peru need to do is like to diversify the export basket of non-so developed commodities, and then to move to specific stages. Because of this, and because of his emphasis on protect the agriculture and mining and other extractive industries during the 60s, he was invited to this St. Gallen University and the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies at Geneva to give some conference about economic development. And he was invited by one of the members of Mont Pèlerin, the Swiss intellectual Jacques Frémont. And then he was invited to the London School of Economics to talk about the same issues as well by Sir Sidney Kane and Peter Bauer, who was a well-known development theorist back in the days. Only to finish in, I think that I want to, I know that I mentioned many of these issues already in a kind of superficial way, but I hope that we can discuss more about these issues. I want to emphasize the participation of Beltrán in this Commission for Development, Housing in Peru, and this agrarian reform of the 1960s. So the idea to trace the evolution of these two commissions is to look at or to figure out that the discussion about economic development in Latin America, and especially in countries as Peru, is more than simply the application of state-led policies. Basically, these neoliberals, these businessmen, intellectuals for Peru, they were taking care of modernizing the country to get rid of the influence of movements as the inspired in the Cuban Revolution, or to trace like an alternative way of supporting the poor social classes in comparison to the offers that both the leftist populists of the APRA and the socialist parties, the communist parties in Peru were offering. So, so the history of this specific policy intervention begins with this Beltrán's appointment as chief of the Commission for Agrarian Reform and Housing in Peru in the 1956, 1958. And Beltrán uses this as institutional vehicle, the design of this housing project as institutional vehicle to create the so-called self-help housing model to expand the private financial sector through the creation of microfinance structure or small cleaning houses structure to finance the so-called casa propia, or the own house for these poor or middle-class people. And here we have a clipping of the La Prensa newspaper, the newspaper of Beltrán, talking about or advertising this project. But also he uses not only this as an institutional vehicle to sell this idea of the microfinances, but also to sell the idea to the United States that's the right way to do development, instead of financing coup d'etats or military intervention to stop the guerrilleros during the 60s. So here there is a famous record about how Beltrán talked about this idea to Eisenhower in his visit to the White House in the 1960s, which was really interesting. I mean, that this is not only in Spanish, but also this appears in the this picture appears also in the records of the New York Times. So that's the way that he got certain support for this housing idea, coming again from his discussions with the people in the American government, his his instrumentalization of the newspaper to popularize this idea that this is the right way to do development policies, and finally by means of intervention in different academic spaces, talk about the Cuban Revolution, as in his famous speech before the UCLA in 1961, and then his intervention, as I already mentioned, representative of the Latin American countries and before the United States during this conference of Punta del Este. And here we have one of these clippings of the New York Times showing Beltrán closing the deal with Douglas Dillon, the last version of the last charter of Punta del Este, which is really interesting in terms of talking about developmental policies by these conservative actors. And to finish, this is in my presentation, I can share with you this presentation. I want to finish with this intervention of these neoliberal think tanks, these Peruvian groups, which main work was to popularize free market ideas through through books which were really easy to read, which were really not so complex, which discusses economic ideas, but not in a well academic and complex or sophisticated way. And in that case, the Centro de Documentación Económica y Social, one of the groups of that were funded by these journalists of Beltrán, of La Prensa, discussed again this idea of the agrarian reform that Beltrán had, this free market agrarian reform, and talk about the idea that to preserve the public confidence or the support coming from the public sphere, the governments and the political parties should apply free market policies, which is also kind of stuff that people as Milton Friedman did with this TV show that he has, Free to Choose, in the 1980s in the United States, or 1970s, I don't remember. But also as people as Henry Hazlitt or William Buckley, well-known American neoliberals, members of the Mont Pèlerin Society, used to discuss in their newspaper and magazine articles. Also, if you can see here, it's really, really interesting, a book to criticize public-run or state-led enterprises, las empresas estatales en el Perú, the public enterprises in Peru. And they are criticizing that the way that possible political candidates or that the governments propose the idea of run certain industries by means of these public enterprises. anyway, the issues that to take a position in favor of the private sector and the private enterprises. And if we can see here, this is one logo of this Centro de Documentación Económica y Social. The truth make you free, or the truth could free you. I don't remember how to translate this, but this is this well-known quotation from the Bible. And here also one of these, I don't know if I have here, yes, one of these elements of this, or one of the principles of this kind of association as the Centro de Documentación Económica y Social is to not only to defend the weight of the human rights, but also to construct the society of life, liberty, justice, and a well-established Christian society as well. So that's the connection that they have with other groups as the Catholic Opus Dei. So this is a lot of evidence for tracing the networking of these associations, and basically this other book published by Acción para el Desarrollo, Action for Development, this specific neoliberal think tank. But yes, I think that I want to conclude with this. And again, I know that it's a little bit, there are many stuff going on here. My intention today was to, as in many of the presentations that I already did regarding this work, is to try to show part of the archival evidence, part of the records, but also try to talk about this issue in a more analytical way in terms of we can grasp the idea that neoliberalism is not only an issue related to these so-called narratives of Naomi Klein's or David Harvey saying like, okay, this is a thing starting in Latin America with the Chile coup d'etat of Pinochet, or starting with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in both United States and the UK. It's more complex than that, and implies also a clash of economic ideas, not in the academic field only, but in the public sphere as a whole. And I think that's a more powerful way in which these actors in countries as Peru stabilize these free market institutions during basically more than 40, 50 years. So it's fascinating. I mean, that of course, I mean, we can say that, okay, we have this coup d'etat of Velasco Alvarado, or the leftist populist movement regime of government of Alan Garcia in the 1980s, but still every time that we had these experiences in Peru, these more state-led experiences or interventionist experiences, the counter movement is strong and comes in terms of economic policy from these groups that I already identify as neoliberals. But anyway, thank you so much, and I think that I am done with this.
Thank you very much, Cesar. I don't know if you hear us. Normally, yes, because the mic is quite good on this computer. We have the habit to open the floor to people online. So if someone online wants to ask question, you can raise your hand or just open your mic and ask Cesar. And otherwise, we will go to the room. But thank you. It was very very interesting. See anybody? Maybe we go voir.
Hello.
I won't have the most
question.
interesting question. Okay, Maya, go.
Okay. Hello. Gracias, César, por tu exposé. Excuse me. I will to talk to you in English. And thank you very much for your exposition. I have two questions for you. You know, in the 190, 300,000 American Indian women were sterilized during Fujimori presidency. In your opinion, which economic model was adopted by Fujimori? is a first question. Second question is which, in your point of view, which economic model do you think is suitable for indigenous communities today in Peru? And the other question, I hope to know what you think about the agrarian reform. You think that the agrarian reform is good when we know that the agrarian reform in South America, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Guatemala, is dismembered in the indigenous community. What do you think?
Okay, should I answer right now or not directly, or should I wait?
You can answer right now. I think it will be easier.
Okay, thank you, Maria, for your questions. Actually, okay, I'm going to be really fast with that, because in the case of Fujimori, Fujimori is this example that some political scientists mention as, I think that the term is bat and switch. I mean, that Fujimori, during the campaign, he started, okay, no, it's the context. I mean, the context of Fujimori was the economic crisis of Peru in the late 1980s, for some of you who maybe don't know well. After this leftist populist regime of Alan Garcia, as I mentioned, so the country faced more than 1,000% of inflation, like in Venezuela, you know, but in a brief, short period of 2 or 3 years. So the solution, or the candidates discussing the possible economic solutions for the country during that time were Mario Vargas Llosa, the guy that I already mentioned, and Alberto Fujimori. So Mario Vargas Llosa was getting in his team of advisors these neoliberal people related to La Prensa, Acción para el Desarrollo, all these people. But Fujimori proposed at the beginning an opposite way to do the economic recovery. But after he got into the office, the Fujimori regime get rid of the initial advisors and hire the advisors of Mario Vargas Llosa to recover the economic situation of the country. So long story short, the issue is that he really was the first president during the 1990s period, or after the government of the leftist populist government of Alan Garcia, to impose this set of neoliberal reforms. So it's a neoliberal regime, the one of Fujimori, for sure. And yes, besides the sterilization, the sterilization process, the illegal sterilization process, that policies that he imposed, which were true, I think that in economic terms, he was commanding, or he was imposing this set of neoliberal policies. Actually, some political scientists and political economists also document the Fujimori regime as one of the first neoliberal populisms of Latin America, as Carlos Menem's Argentina as well. So, or I think that Color de Melo, Fernando Henrique Cardoso in Brazil. So it's really, he got this popular base because of the message of the discourse on campaign, but in office, he implemented these more neoliberal pro-austerity or pro-free market policies. In terms of the agrarian reforms, I think that in Peru, we had this design, or this blueprint for the agrarian reform coming from these neoliberal guys. It was imposed in certain areas of Peru, but not in the whole country. Then there were a second attempt of agrarian reform during the 1964, financed by the Alliance for Progress. It's a second attempt, but the fully developed attempt, the one which already was applied, is the Velasco Alvarado agrarian reform of the 1969, which was basically a confiscation of lands, which was really it was a replication of the Cuban experience in Peru, basically. And that was the way that he basically get rid of the whole landowners gathered in this Sociedad Nacional Agraria represented or headed by Beltrán. So in terms of the correlation of forces, the political forces in Peru, this agrarian reform meant a lot, even though it was not so similar as the previous attempts, and the neoliberal attempt was more like a kind of re-privatization of lands, or re-regulation of lands, rather than a concrete agrarian reform. But I'm telling this to explain the context, but also for saying that I think that even though nowadays we cannot think about the same institutional designs or same policy designs for land reforms, I think that those make a huge stuff in terms of a distribution of economic opportunities in countries, in underdeveloped or developing countries as Peru. And what was the third one? I forgot the third one. Well, I mean, I'm gonna figure out this before I can remember, but yes, I think that that's, there is a third point, Maria, I guess you mentioned.
Yes.
Could you remind
me? Yeah, it's.
Well, I cannot hear you.
Maria is getting.
Yes, Maria is not. No. Okay, anyway, no, I can wait. Okay, there is another. Okay, you tell me, guys. There is another question.
Yeah, we don't hear on it either. Gregor, you had a question?
There's also one in the chat.
Okay.
One question I had, but it's just because I don't have this much culture on the subject. At some point, you talked about structuralist policy as an alternative to neoliberal developmentalism. And just for the layman, I wonder what was concretely meant by structuralist alternative.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, we usually mention in the economic thought and political economy this idea that as I already discussed, especially in Latin America. In Latin America, we had during the 60s this problem of, okay, how are we gonna develop our countries? Back in the days, also it was understood that the way to develop the countries was by means of increasing the GDP per capita, but also to engage portions of the population who were working mainly in agricultural industries to the more value-added industries. So the main one during that time was the manufacturing. So the processes of industrialization were a main way to do that. That's the reason why certain Latin American economists or intellectuals were in favor of these industrializations, but substitution of imports, which mean like to stop to import capital goods or minimum developed capital or middle developed capital goods to produce those in the national territory, in the domestic economy. And this idea of industrialization, but also support to the agriculture, or to increase the value added in the agriculture sector, the productivity in the agriculture sector, or this another characteristic of the Latin American economy since that time, but also which also prevails till these days, is that these dual labor markets. All these specific problems were targeted by a group of economists called these structuralist economists, mainly following the ideas of Raúl Prebisch. Raúl Prebisch was an Argentinian economist, very important in the Latin American discussions and taking part of specific commissions in United Nations offices as the UNCTAD, and then this important one, which is Economic Commission for Latin America, the CEPAL. So in the CEPAL, many Latin American economists following these ideas. So we need to do industrialization, we need to do land reforms. So we increase the productivity of the land, not to let the landlords to accumulate a lot of land, a lot of portions of land that they are not going to produce at all. So it's not going to be productive, not even for the food security of the country, not even for the wages of the peasants or for the revenues of the peasants. So all of them were gathered in this commission, Economic Commission for Latin America, and gathered in this kind of group of thinkers. Many of them influenced by Keynes, but also some of them influenced by people as Kaleski, the post-Keynesian economist, John Robinson, or by Marxist economists. I mean, that land reforms were basically a proposal of people as the Austrian Social Democrats, as Luxemburg, or I don't remember the other one. But anyway, yes, so these people were gathered in this group. So basically it's that nowadays it's called a heterodox crowd of economists, or heterodox economist group there taking place in Latin America. And then, but again, these neoliberal people were against them, because basically land reforms imposing land reforms mean to go against the advantages and the interests of the landowners. Industrialization but substitution of imports means to go against the interests of the people involved with import of commodities, people in the chambers of commerces. So there you go. I mean, there were a lot of political struggle, but also ideological, or another one in terms of economic ideas. So the structuralists were basically the pro-intervention, pro-industrialization, pro-land reform guys back in the days. With theoretical developments. It's not like only political discourse. They had theoretical developments and economic ideas behind.
I'm sorry, but the time is out and we have to stop it because other people here have classes or meetings.
Yes.
I think there's one question in the chat.
I can't have one little question, please. I have to know, is it possible in Peru a process of constitution, a plurinational state as in Bolivia and Ecuador? What do you think is possible?
Well, I would be interested to discuss that, but I don't want to say so much. I think that currently not, but it's a thing that many of us are concerned to do, especially not as a constitutional assembly, but a set of constitutional reforms.
Okay.
Yes, I think that it's tricky right now because we don't have the same constituency as in Bolivia or in Chile. That's a pity that happens nowadays in Peru.
Right.
So thank you very much for your presentation, César. It was very, very interesting, and we're keeping in touch. And have a good day, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And again, it's wonderful to discuss these issues and to have your attention. I really appreciate that. So have a good day there as well.
It was a pleasure.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye.
Hasta
Bye-bye.
pronto. Chao, chao.
Nos vemos. Chao, chao.
Nos vemos.